Morning glory, America, bonjour, hi, Canada, and good day to our Jewish friends who are celebrating Shavuot. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway on this Monday morning, and this is the rundown of the news that you may have missed overnight and over the weekend. The IDF hit Hamas tunnels in massive strikes last night. This after another rocket barrage from Gaza into southern Israel. It seems to me pretty clear that if Hamas wants the Israelis to stop bombing their tunnels and buildings, they've got to stop sending rockets at the civilians of Israel. And then maybe they can talk about ceasefire. Many people in the world want a ceasefire. Tell Hamas to stop sending rockets at Israeli civilians. The IDF also struck an intelligence compound in Gaza. They are very precise. There are still civilian casualties, 200 plus in Gaza, according to the Hamas medical system, and a dozen in Israel. But there will continue to be casualties as long as Hamas continues to send rockets into Israel. This is not close. This is not a morally complex situation. A country has the right to defend itself. Imagine, as one Israeli Defense Force general said last night, if even one missile hit Washington, what we would do. More than 3,000 missiles at Israel in the last week, beginning today, a week ago. For the third time, the U.S. has blocked a Security Council statement urging ceasefire because they realize that all of America, save a very noisy 5%, is strongly with our strongest ally and the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel. The New York Times continues to astonish. Their headline yesterday, after years of quiet, Israeli-Palestinian conflict exploded. Why now? Why now? Why now? If you fire 3,000 missiles into a country, that country is going to defend itself. The why now is quite simply Hamas wanted a war. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They miscalculated badly. I believe they believe that the political paralysis in Israel would significantly impair a coherent response. In fact, it unleashed the whirlwind. And now to stop the whirlwind, they have to put up a white flag. They have to stop sending missiles into Israel. Tensions among Democrats grow over Israel as the left defends Palestinians. Look, I'll defend Palestinians too. One of the most popular movies at Salem right now is Hope in the Holy Land. And I indeed hope that the Holy Land will become peaceful and that what I saw when I was last there, I've been to Israel twice, could not tell the difference between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews and Israeli Christians, for that matter, walking on the streets, completely integrated society. There are, of course, predominantly Arab neighborhoods, predominantly Jewish neighborhoods, even a couple of predominantly Christian neighborhoods. But no apartheid, no daily tension, though there have been race riots this week. And I tell you, Democratic Party has lost its way. Its anger at Israel is unbelievable, and it's driven by AOC and the squad, Bernie Sanders and the hard left. They've always been anti-Israel. They remain anti-Israel. It does not appear as though Joe Biden brought back the anti-Israeli group from Team Obama with him. I told you on Friday, Ben Rhodes got voted off the island. Tommy Vietor and the rest of the pod boys got voted off the island, and maybe it was because they were anti-Israel, and Joe Biden has traditionally been a friend of Israel. We hope he continues to be. The building that housed Hamas intel centers and war factory manufacturers also had some media outlets, including AP, and the media outlets were outraged that their offices were destroyed. Well, Israel showed the smoking gun to American intel officials, proving that Hamas was in the building. At the Washington Free Beacon, there was an expose that AP even knew Hamas was in the building. Had pictures on the wall that did, demonstrated agreement with Hamas. There were holes in the wall. They all knew. They chose to be there. And I do not. I'm a member of the press. I believe the press should be avoided as targets. They are not immune from collateral damage. They are not immune from friendly fire, and lots of journalists have been hurt badly over many, many years. Ernie Pyle was killed in World War II, which is the ultimate sacrifice. But wearing a press pass in a war zone does not create an invisible shield around you, nor can a besieged state like Israel take into account the fact that a media group is cohabitating a building with a terrorist organization, for the simple reason that that which gets rewarded gets repeated. If that worked, if that gave invulnerability to Hamas, they'd put reporters in every building in which they operated. They wouldn't need the tunnel system, which is in terrible disrepair now. From the Times of Israel, Israeli Defense Force believes it significantly hurt Hamas, and that's the best it can do for now. This is by Judah Ari Gross. They're not going to go in and fight street by street. The casualties to the IADF, number one lost soldier at this point, half dozen to a dozen civilians, including a 5-year-old boy, but they're not going in and on the ground. They continue to pummel the so-called metro, the underground tunnel network in Gaza, with precise strikes. They continue to blow up members of Hamas and their homes and raise the cost. Meanwhile, there's the BESA Center, BESA Center, has a great story on how the IDF has to increase its order of battle and reconstitute its long-neglected territory, which is by Major General Gershon Hakohen, and I believe he is a very smart guy at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He served in the IDF for 42 years. I'll get back to that. We hope to have Michael Oren back tomorrow. Meanwhile, there have been anti-Semitic riots all over the world, and in London, a convoy adorned with Palestinian flags drove through North London with shouts of "F the Jews, rape their daughters, free Palestine," and they were all arrested. Good for that. One Democrat who stood out from the Bronx, Representative Richie Torres, voiced his commitment to the Jewish state's safety and sovereignty. Good for him. On the domestic side, ransomware is now recognized as a national security threat. I know this. I was at a gathering of Republican senators this weekend. I heard Mike Pompeo talk about this with some cybersecurity experts, and it is genuinely a deep threat everywhere to every business. And one of those areas where we don't know what we are doing in response to ransomware attacks, but we've got to have the capacity, and companies need to harden their infrastructure. One of the interesting stories in the Wall Street Journal this morning, retailers try to solve labor imbalances by retraining their staff. They are taking 43 Levi's employees who are enrolled in the San Francisco company's machine learning boot camp, and they're teaching them how to be retailers. Because the record 8.1 million job vacancies is getting worse. AT&T is in talks to combine media assets, including CNN, with the Discovery Channel. Maybe they can discover the news at CNN. That would be a good thing. Meanwhile, we also have, that's a $150 billion deal, by the way. The Treasury in the United Kingdom is preparing for a bonfire of EU red tape. This is the best part about Brexit, breaking free of Brussels. The Treasury has been scrutinizing the whole suite of finance regulations which were kept in British law after the departure from the European Union. They're about to cut it all out. London is going to become the new Singapore. London is going to become the place to do business. The Telegraph also had a great bit of news yesterday. 4 good reasons why communist China will never become the world superpower. Demography was first. The one-child policy is second. After the one-child policy came a couple of more reasons. Look, it's not over. It's not over. Let me tell you the other good news. The Angel Tree camps are back. The Angel Tree camps are open. The Angel Tree camps take care of the sons and daughters of people who are incarcerated. One or both parents could be in prison. Last year, they took some fun stuff to the kids where they lived. It's not the same as getting a week out in the wild, having fun with Angel Tree counselors. And now they're reopened. All we have to do is get the kids there. A donation of $200 sends a kid to Angel Tree Camp. Please go to Hugh Hewitt this morning, hughhewitt.com. At the very top, you'll see a banner for Angel Tree. Let's fill those camps up. These children have not been out of their environment for 2 years. This is a great ministry. Please contribute at HughHewitt.com at the very top. Come right back. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for joining me. I'm joined now by the one and only Salena Zito, she of the Yinzer Report and columns in the Washington Examiner and the New York Post, here to tell us about a Lackawanna showdown. Actually, if you don't know where Lackawanna is, you're not alone, but Salena can tell us where Lackawanna is and why it matters. Good morning, Salena.
Good morning, you. How are you this morning?
I'm always great. I hate your website. I hate the Washington Examiner website. But beside that, nevertheless, tell us about Lackawanna and the Senate race on it's Tuesday night, huh?
It's Tuesday night. So Lackawanna County is the county where the city of Scranton sits. And in case you didn't know this, Joe Biden grew up there. That's where he was born.
And we are on right now in 2 stations in Scranton. So we're talking to Scranton as we speak.
Good morning, Scranton. So there is a state Senate seat. It's the 22nd, and it has been held by Democrats since 1970, since Richard Nixon's first term. And it is there's going to be a special election for that seat on Tuesday. It's been held by Senator John Blake, since 2010. He's a moderate Democrat, and he just up and decided to resign his seat in February. Sort of shocked everyone, but he made this decision sort of a couple months after he was taken out of leadership in the state Senate in Pennsylvania. I think it's really important to note that the Pennsylvania Democrats expected to win the majority in the state, and they didn't. Not only did they not win any new seats, but they actually lost seats. And he was taken out by a very progressive freshman, someone who did not have the years of experience in the Senate that he did. But, the leadership in the state Senate in Pennsylvania has become incredibly liberal.
So Marty Flynn is way to the left. Marty Flynn is the Democrat. He's way to the left.
Yeah, he's the one that's running. He's a state rep currently. He's the one that's running for the state Senate seat. He last year, during the beginning of the pandemic, he had this incredible, that's the most generous word I can think of to use. He had this incredible rant on Facebook against the small business people of his district. If they didn't like something, I can't remember his exact words, but something to the tune of, you didn't like, Democrats, we know what to do, or something like that, something to that.
Something ominous. And he's running against Chris. What's Chris's last name? Chris Chermak. Chris Chermak. 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 Is it possible that they flip this switch from seat from blue to red?
Yeah, it's incredibly possible. What is really crazy, under the radar, on Saturday, President Joe Biden endorsed in this race for state Senate for a special election. Now, Lackawanna County has not voted for Republican for president, I think, since 1968. However, it has moved in the same way you've seen these counties move in my home state, in the West, but also in the Northeast, which is where Scranton is located. And it's moved towards the Republicans every 4 years. And so Luzerne County and Monroe County are also part of this. Luzerne County is famously known for flipping like 20 points between Barack Obama and Donald Trump in giving Donald Trump the county in 2016, also in 2020, first time it had given a Republican the presidential vote again since around Nixon. So
Are they using the same? Are they using the same screwball rules that Pennsylvania voted with during the pandemic, or have they reverted to the norm?
It's you. All of a sudden, the urgency to vote by mail has disappeared, and so I think it'll be really interesting. I'm really interested to see what happens in this primary. It's a primary election in an off-year election. However, I think that the enthusiasm is definitely on the side of the Republicans.
I can't wait to see turnout, and I know Salena Zito, you'll be bringing it to us. For all things Salena, go to selenazito.com. Thank you, my Yinzer friend. I had someone tell me this weekend they love listening to you on Monday. You're always cheery. I said, that's because she doesn't have to watch the Pirates anymore. She's given up. selenazito.com. And remember, over at hughhewitt.com at the very top, you will see the Angel Tree Camping banner. Please go join the Fetching Mrs. Hewitt and I. It's a year to get these kids, after 2 years, back to nature for a week. Please help Angel Tree Camps at hughhewitt.com at the very top. Stay tuned. Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Good day to our Jewish listeners as Shavuot begins. I'm joined by Jake Sherman of Punchbowl News. If you are not a subscriber to Punchbowl News, I get it every morning right before Jake comes on, and I read through it, and it's usually absolutely on target. Punchbowlnews.com. Jake, let's talk about the split in the Democratic Party. On Saturday, the New York Times ran a story which continued to Sunday. Tensions among Democrats grow over Israel as the left defends Palestinians, led by AOC and the Squad. This is the first time in my memory that the Democratic Party has not turned towards an Israeli-Palestinian or an Israeli-Hezbollah conflict unified in defense of the Jewish state. Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised. This has been happening for a while, Hugh. And to be clear, just to be fair, most of the Democratic Party, I would say most, is with the Israelis, who are longtime allies. And at the same time of this, as the progressives were standing up were on the floor making their case against the Israelis, there were a group of Democrats led by Elaine Luria of Virginia Beach, Virginia, they were making the case for Israel, defending Israel and defending Netanyahu and the strikes. But listen, as this goes on, it does present not a conundrum, but just a split for Democrats, right? I mean, Nancy Pelosi in her press conference on Friday, I believe it was, if I can remember my dates right, made the case that you would hear out of Lindsey Graham, which is Israel's national security is America's national security. Hamas is a terrorist organization. We are with the Palestinian people, but we're not with Hamas or the Palestinian or the government or the terrorist organization that's indiscriminately striking Israeli citizens. So the top of the party, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, a longtime ally of Israel and of Netanyahu personally. The top of the party is still in the traditional place that Democrats have been in.
So, Jake, my question, are there more Democrats who are pro-Palestinian than there are Republicans who are anti-Liz Cheney?
I don't know the answer to that, Hugh, but I would say that, listen, it's an interesting evolution. I mean, it's an interesting evolution of the party. And, part of this, I think, dates back all the way to the Boehner years when we saw Netanyahu come to give a joint address. And many of these people weren't in Congress yet, but gave a joint address to a Congress that was a Republican House, but it was a pretty not antagonistic speech toward America, but it was a bold move, right? Going to America, Netanyahu, and speaking against the American president in the Hall of Congress, which was about the Iran deal. Now, I was with Boehner right afterwards. Boehner went to Israel for not a victory lap, but it was a victory lap of sorts, I would say. And it was an interesting kind of example, an interesting scene for the American-Israeli relationship.
No, my point, though, Jake, is every set of stories is a mirror on the American media. Last week, including me, I had Congresswoman Cheney on to talk about the split in the GOP over her comments, and I covered it like everybody other covered it. But of course, Beltway Manhattan media just piled on. They couldn't get enough of Cheney versus the party. This week, there are more Democrats that are anti-Israel than there were Republicans who were pro-Cheney. And I've seen one New York Times story about the fact that they've got a problem in the Democratic Party and that they have a pretty solid group of American Jewish voters who are now confronted with one party that is uniformly pro-Israel and another that is split. And not merely split, deeply split. Now, I don't think it's 50-50. I think it's more like 20-80, maybe 25-75 with the anti-Israel vote. But AOC and Tlaib and that gang is really anti-Israel. I'm not even sure they support the right of Israel to exist. Someone should ask them that, whether or not they're with Hamas on the map question. Have you seen any reporting on that?
I've not. I think they've said they're right. They believe in the right to Israel to exist. I think they just take issue with the parties.
I don't know, Jake. I honestly, I haven't seen him ask because I think most of us in the mainstream, you are, I am, believe that Israel's got a right to exist and Hamas is a terrorist organization. But when asked about that, AOC sidestepped whether or not Hamas is a terrorist organization. And I do believe because of the general partisan nature of every story, our elite media is not pushing this rump group of Democrats who are so anti-Israel. I mean, they're very anti-Israel to accountability on this. Cori Bush of Missouri, until all our citizens are safe, until all our children are safe, we will continue to fight for our rights in Palestine and in Ferguson. I mean, that's just, it's almost like their left wing has gone off a cliff.
Yeah, I mean, listen, remember a couple of years ago, the years blend together. I think it was 2018. Tlaib and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar were, I think, banned from going into Israel, which was definitely an interesting experience. And I think even the Democratic leadership spoke up against Netanyahu for banning them from Israel. So anyway, it is a very interesting situation. But you're right. I mean, questions need to be asked, and this is going to be. And I mean, we've written and we have at the top this morning about the split in the Democratic Party and how it's uncomfortable, and we have been covering this for days. So I anticipate we will continue to.
Now, I was looking at Punchbowl News today, and no one knows, so it's not there. Where are we on the counteroffer that Senator Capito of West Virginia, is charged with providing Team Biden with a counteroffer to their $2.1 trillion? Where are we on that?
Today or tomorrow. Needs to come today or tomorrow, and Shelley Moore Capito has suggested it will come today or tomorrow. She said it will be coming at the first part of this week. Listen, I'm actually becoming a little bit more bullish on the chances for a bipartisan transportation deal. Just because if you game this out a little bit, $800 billion, no tax increases, neither side could say no to that. And I mean, listen, maybe Democrats have and then Democrats spend the rest of the year trying to figure out how to get their American Family Plan, which is a huge package with all sorts of tax increases, all sorts of things Republicans will never go through Congress. But I mean, $800 billion is a lot of money, and if it doesn't increase the corporate rate at all, and it's paid for by increased IRS enforcement plus user fees, that's a pretty good deal for both sides.
Yes, it is, and if it's spaced out so it doesn't have the inflationary impact of $2.1 trillion, because we do have an inflation problem. I know you follow that in Punchbowl News. And I encourage my audience, go to punchbowlnews.com and subscribe, because Jake does give it to you the way. So you think they'll come back with something that will be acceptable?
I do. Well, I don't know if it'll be acceptable at the outset. I think it will be a step in the right direction. I mean, listen, if you think of where Joe Biden is right now, he campaigned on being bipartisan, on being almost transpartisan, if you think about it, right? Not governing as a Democrat. He has governed as a liberal progressive Democrat so far. So it's in his interest to get a large-scale bipartisan deal. It just is. I don't see how he doesn't do it if it's on the table. So,
So the key question, Jake, the key question will be, is it good for Ohio? And that's actually going to be the question that every senator asks about their state when they're presented with an infrastructure bill. Do you have any glimpse as to how they're going to allocate the spending between the states? Obviously, Ohio should get the lion's share, but how do they allocate the money between states? Is it per capita?
I don't know the answer to that, but if you think about it this way, if you have the stimulus in 2009, 2010 was flawed because it was only one party, right? And that then therefore the other side could politicize it. If both parties have their hands on this in the Senate, both parties will have their hands on it in the House, maybe not a majority of Republicans, but some. And then it just becomes very difficult to politicize and very difficult to say this is bad, this is no good. I just have to assume, and listen, we're a far way off, but if you think about the Republicans that would go for this in the Senate, Shelley Moore Capito, Mitt Romney, maybe a Todd Young, I mean, the list is long. Who knows who could go for it? If it's $800 billion, no tax increases, that's a pretty big win. And listen, we wrote about this last week, Hugh. McConnell and Pelosi and Schumer are devolving or are redistributing their power more than ever before. I mean, McConnell has given a long leash to Shelley Moore Capito here, and that is important because Capito wants to come to a deal.
And she's also very, very smart. I hope, Jake, I'll follow Punchbowl News. I hope you do find AOC in Tlaib and just ask him, does Israel have a right to exist? Just ask him. Please ask him for me. And please, America, go to punchbowlnews.com, the indispensable start to your morning every single day. I want to remind everyone as well, we have reopened the camps for prison fellowship, the Angel Tree camps. The children who have a parent or two parents in jail need to get out of the center of their city. They need to get out into camps. They're reopened after 2 years. COVID has passed them by. Now they can go, but they need your help. Please go give right now. Your donation will immediately show up. $200 per camper. Make a child's summer. Get them out of the big city. Get them to camp. With the Angel Tree Prison Fellowship Camping, it's at the top of HughHewitt.com. It takes a second to load. Give it a chance to load. And please be generous. Come right back. Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt. That music means Jim Geraghty of National Review joins us. Good morning, James. How are you?
Hugh, how are you?
I'm great. I have a objective question for you. I mean, I need a question that calls for an objective answer. Last week, there was a split in the Republican Party between those who voted for Liz Cheney and those who voted for Elise Stefanik. It was somewhat covered by the media, sort of like wall-to-wall, endless carpet bombing coverage of Liz Cheney and Elise Stefanik. This week, there's a split in the Democratic Party between those who support Israel and those who don't. And there's been one story in the New York Times. Just what's your guess at the proportion of stories about Liz Cheney versus those about AOC, Tlaib, and the rest of the anti-Israel Democrats?
Wait, Hugh, did something happen in the Middle East last week? Wait, yes, I did see a short headline at the bottom of the front page beneath the 5 articles on every aspect of the number 3 person in the House Republican Conference getting dismissed and replaced. I mean, that was the biggest deal. Look, Hugh, you can't begrudge the media for giving that kind of saturation coverage of the departure of Liz Cheney, in part because the media has always loved the Cheneys, going back generations. And the other thing is that the real issue is that there was no news regarding jobs numbers, the consumer price index and inflation, or news at the border. There just wasn't any figures coming out that someone could say, hey, this is really big news and it looks bad for the administration. Oh, wait, yes, there was, Hugh. There was tons of that. Is Liz Cheney a story? Sure. Did it need the media loves stories of Republicans fighting with other Republicans.
Sure it does, and they carpet bomb them. And I had Liz Cheney on, too. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I wanted to cover the story. You bet.
Yeah, and it is big news. I also would point out that this past weekend, deranged lunatic Lynn Wood got thrashed in his effort to become the South Carolina Republican Party chair. As anybody who read I think I wrote 2 corner posts on this. I didn't think this was a huge story. The story is crazy man says crazy things and launches long shot bid to become state party chairman in a state that he's lived for about 20 minutes. I exaggerate slightly, but I think he moved there in February, right?
And he got totally blown out. Totally blown out.
He got maybe like 20-some percent. Is there a group? But Trump endorsed actually the current chairman, and it was just one of those McKissick, And it was one of those things like Lynn Wood goes out and says crazy things. And the media loves to say, look at this Republican saying crazy things. The thing is that, like, the guy on the street corner is saying crazy things, too, but because he doesn't identify himself as a Republican, the media is less interested in that guy who's saying that, his dog is talking to him and stuff like that. So.
And Dan Crenshaw goes on with my friend Chuck Todd yesterday, and Dan says what is true, what I know to be true, because I also go out and talk to people, nobody knows about the Republican caucus or cares about the Republican caucus. They do care about inflation, and that becomes a point of contention online. But let's go back to the Democrats, Jim. This is historic. I think 20% of their party is anti-Israel. And I have seen no one ask AOC and Tlaib with anything like the rigor that it deserves, do you support the existence of the state of Israel? Unconditionally, unqualifiedly, do you support the existence of the state of Israel? Should that question be asked of these Democrats?
Yeah, and when AOC is tweeting out, that it's an apartheid state, I think we can presume the answer is no. Like, nobody says it's an apartheid state, and yes, I think it should exist.
Well, I don't think we should presume. I just think we should ask. And she's got reporters all over her, as does, and Tlaib, I don't know if she supports, and this is a Democratic Party problem.
It is. It's a continuation of a long trend. We have seen the Democratic. There used to be, a fairly bipartisan consensus that while the United States wanted to have Middle East peace, and every American president would send out envoys, and Bill Clinton hosting Arafat and Rabin at the White House. It's been this long. If America just tries hard enough, somehow we can get these two groups to agree. And unfortunately, Hugh, it's an intractable issue in which Hamas and Hezbollah and all these other extremist groups want to kill the Israelis, and the Israelis refuse to die, and they won't meet halfway in the middle of maiming or something. I have long since believed. Actually, there was a lot of people who were furious at the Trump administration for taking a fairly hands-off approach to this, and then they went through the Abraham Accords, kind of a different route of saying we're not even going to worry that much about the Israelis and Palestinians. We're going to reach out to these other Arab regimes, and we're going to say, hey, would you like a trade deal? You may not love the Israelis, but how'd you like to make money? How's that sound? And gradually, bit by bit, you ended up getting a couple of, historically significant agreements that also kind of said to the Palestinians, hey, the Arab world is not forever behind your side. The train is leaving the station. You guys can sit around and continue to blow up pizzerias and bomb people and, elect a terror group like Hamas and have this terror group speak for you. But the rest of the Arab world is tired of getting tied up in all this stuff, and they're more worried about Iran. And I don't see a much more accurate thing. Now, I saw Joe Biden is sending an envoy, so, Hugh, I assume that's going to solve the problem, right?
You bet. My favorite headline of the weekend, and I want to go back to something about the media, is after years of quiet, the New York Times asked yesterday, Israeli-Palestinian conflict exploded. Why now? ? Well, maybe it's because they sent 3,000 missiles at the civilians in Israel.
Yeah, and let's point out. Actually, we should point out that Hamas and Hezbollah periodically they launched a few missiles here, a few missiles there during the Trump years. But it's very hard to believe that there's no factor in the change in administrations in Washington and the recognition that if they had done this, Donald Trump didn't give a hoot if the world was outraged at Israel. He didn't, he wasn't gonna. Oh, the UN is denouncing them. Well, okay, I better change our policy. Biden, on the other hand, does. I think Biden really does believe that there's a sense that the U.S. has to be a honest broker, and we can't be seen as too close to Israel. We've got to hold them at arm's length. And the entire Obama administration had taken clearly a much less warm and friendly line to the Israelis than previous administrations had. And I think Biden's going to continue that, because even if he personally has no animosity towards Israel, you got to look at the crowd around him and what they did during the Obama years and expect, we're in for another 4 years of the same.
So, Jim, here's my bigger question. I asked this of Senator Scott this weekend. Ronna McDaniel is the party chair, and Tom Emmer, who runs the NRCC. So the chair of the Republican Senate Committee, the chair of the Republicans House Committee, and the chair of the party. Said, look, the media is now 95% Democrats, an extension of the Democratic Party, and the younger ones are woke, woke, woke. Why are you still engaging? And they said, well, we got it. Rick Scott is for talking to anyone at any time, and he's been good at it. But I just generally wonder, does there come a point when the media is so imbalanced, I think we are there, that the Republicans adopt as a recommendation to their members, don't go, don't talk, don't engage, because they're just not interested in the story. They are interested in hammering you. Are we there yet? Because if you walk down the same street and you get mugged every time, and then you get mugged and you complain to me, and I tell you don't walk down that street, and you do it again, you get mugged again, do I have sympathy for you? No.
I remember hearing from folks in the George W. Bush administration that they would actually find dealing with particularly like war on terror related stuff, dealing with the New York Times, dealing with the Washington Post. They were actually the people on the beat were generally reasonable, and generally the article, at least they would listen to them, they'd get their quotes into the story, they would give their side of events. It would be. That was reasonable, but that the editors back in New York or back at the bureau would then put like the most egregious headline possible onto the pieces. So the text that was getting submitted into the editorial process was not ludicrously unfair, but the meat grinding process of editing turned it into something bad. I do wonder how much that whether that's gone and whether it's it's no longer a matter of one or two of particular bad editors changing things, or whether it's an all-purpose issue that's top to bottom in some of these institutions. Or if you can get a good article in the New York Times, the Washington Post, that can do a lot of good. It can really let's face it. There are times where throughout this entire pandemic, going back years, decades, we've been talking for a long time. You feel like you're swimming upstream. You feel like there's this ludicrous conventional wisdom of X is true, and you look at the data. Actually, no, X is not true. Y is true. If I can write Y is true until the cows come home. I will influence my audience, but it's not nearly as big as the audience of the New York Times or the Washington Post. And the rest of the media across the country takes their cues from the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Okay, to stretch my analogy, though, in the first case, that's like saying a nice gang member walks you down the street 3/4 of the way and takes care of you, and then you're mugged at the end of the street. Or once in a while, you get to the deli at the end of the street and you get a sandwich. And, do you still... Can I listen to you complain if you insist on walking down the street because you like that deli sandwich so much? And did you happen? I'm going to ask Dwayne if Dwayne came in today. I never know when he comes to work. It's he just if he's one of those guys who's working from home even though the studio's not at home.
I'm here.
Okay, Jim. So I want you to send him the Becky Anderson interview with Naftali Bennett. She is one of the main deals on CNN International. Did you listen to this, Jim?
I have not.
I
don't think I get CNN International.
It is the most anti-Israel screed from a, quote, anchor, close quote. It makes Don Lemon look like, a Rip-On Society member. It is just absolutely out there. And when I think about that, I just wonder if it isn't time to say, overdone, we're not going to do it anymore.
It may be that case. The thing is you have to make sure you've got a well-developed alternative to get your message out rather than the institutions. And maybe this is where folks... Let me put it this way. I'll make, to bring this kind of full circle. So Liz Cheney takes her stance, and she's very critical of Trump. She doesn't like the fact that Trump keeps insisting he won the election. She's got every right to do so. She is correct to do so. Trump's being ridiculous, et cetera, et cetera. Her first big op-ed of what we need to stand for was in the Washington Post. And Hugh, I don't think that helps, because I think the Washington Post op-ed page, Kraushaar's passed away, God rest his soul. Will still is over there. I guess they run Mark Peason every now and then. But
they run me every now and then. I'm in once a week.
There's this other guy with silver hair. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But in other words, like if you are a Republican and you write your message to the Washington Post, lots of other conservatives will see that as not communicating it to other conservatives. I'm not saying she had to do the Washington Times. I'm not sure, but maybe, if not to plug National Review, maybe the Washington Examiner, maybe some of these other, it seems, it's like the Washington Post, certainly the New York Times, even though it's got David Brooks and even though it's got Ross Douthat, and they run, other conservatives every now and then. These institutions are not really trusted by conservatives for good reason, and they're not really trusted by Republicans for good reason. So when a Republican chooses to communicate through them, the perception is they're not communicating to me.
Unless you're Tom Cotton and you have a secret mission to blow them up, because that's what he did. Geraghty, the indispensable, always good to talk to you. Get the Morning Jolt, Jim's morning newsletter. You got to go to nationalreview.com, nro.com, and pick up sign for the Morning Jolt. If you don't get it, you're behind the conservative center-right curve. Morning, glory, America, and good day to our Jewish listeners who are celebrating Shavuot today. I'm joined by Nick Kristof, New York Times columnist. Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Good morning. Really well. Thank you, Hugh.
I want to begin by asking, actually just agreeing with you out loud about your most recent column, Education Poses an Existential Threat to Extremism. Within it, you argue for the immediate entry in the United States, if they want to come, of the 17,000 translators who have worked with the United States and NATO allies. Why do you take that position? I agree with it wholeheartedly, but explain why you think that's important.
Sure. I mean, interpreters like that have kept me alive. They've kept American troops alive in Afghanistan. They've done so at enormous risk already. And at the end of the day, the Taliban is going to be spreading around Afghanistan when we leave. They may or may not take Kabul, but those people who worked for the U.S. are going to be at enormous risk, and their families will be. And many of them will be killed if we do not look after them. I think it is both a matter of justice that we look after them, and also a matter of that if we let them be slaughtered, then people in other countries will not want to work for the U.S. again.
100% agree. Now, I always disclose my son works for Congressman Michael Waltz, who is a Green Beret and did a number of tours in Afghanistan. One of his interpreters and their family was, in fact, executed by the Taliban when they were caught by the Taliban. So he's very adamant about this. I don't think this should be refugee status. I think there ought to be a special visa status for any Iraqi and Afghan translator and their family, Nick Kristof, because it's 17,000 people, and that's 17,000 executions. I don't even think there's any doubt in my mind that where the Taliban takes over, those people are dead and their families are dead.
And their families, yeah. It's 17,000, interpreters and assistants, but, there are several people in their families who would also be at enormous risk.
So then I want to take it a step further. Your column is primarily about educating women and how education ends extremism. 100% agree. What should we do about women teachers? Because again, if the Taliban takes over the area where women have been teaching, they will be targeted as well. Should they have a special category?
Well, so they will not necessarily be targeted. It depends on their own story. But the Taliban in many areas has allowed women teachers of girls. And in fact, they're more comfortable with women teaching girls than with men teaching girls. So in fact, that's been one of the changes over the last 20 years, that the local Taliban commanders in many areas have allowed girls to be educated, but it requires, girls to be taught separately from boys. They're more comfortable with primary school than with high school. They want women teachers. They want community support. It can't have a school that says it's a gift of the U.S. It's easier to do this if the classes are in a mosque and include some Quranic instruction. There are all kinds of negotiations that have to take place, but many of those teachers are in fact women, and if they don't have ties to the Afghan police or the Afghan army or to the government in Kabul, then then they will, for the most part, be okay. Those who do have ties, I think that I think we again should look after them, and initially help them resettle in Kabul. And if Kabul seems at risk, then I do think we should bring them to the U.S.
It's a great column. People should read it. Education Posing an Existential Threat to Extremism. Now let us disagree amicably. What your taxes are paying for in Israel. First of all, you say you're uncomfortable with the word apartheid state. Not only am I uncomfortable with it, Nick, I reject it. Israel's a democracy. In fact, in the last few months, the Ra'am party of Islamists have been holding the balance of power, negotiating with both Likud and the anti-Likud blocs. There is nothing of apartheid in Israel. It's so far removed from apartheid state. It should be rejected and denounced. I don't think you did denounce it. Why not?
Because I agree with you that within Israel, Arabs are part of a democracy. In the West Bank, they clearly are not. Clearly, there's a difference in how Arabs or Palestinians are treated, and Israeli settlers are treated not only in their right to vote, which of course Palestinians don't have, in their access to water, which they get about 10% of, in their ability to use roads. There is no doubt that Palestinians are treated very differently in Israel's occupied territories.
But Israel itself is not an apartheid state. I think that's they are treated differently in the West Bank for security reasons, and I understand that. But I just don't like when people call it an apartheid state because it's so far removed from that. Now I wanted to ask you about why are your tax dollars going there? Well, they are our greatest ally in the Middle East. They are part, along with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and other Arab states, of the coalition against Iran. And they are a free state, the only free state there. Why wouldn't we give them military aid, Nick? It's better that they fight their own wars than we have to go and help them.
But why should we give aid of any kind to a country, to a wealthy country that can pay for it itself? I mean, we wouldn't give. Britain is a wonderful ally, but we wouldn't give military aid to Britain. And if Israelis want military equipment, then they're in a position to buy it. Israel can afford universal health care, while the U.S. has not been able to provide that. And so I think that if a wealthy country like Israel wants military equipment, then it should buy it.
Well, there are obviously analogs in Germany where we base tens of thousands of troops, in South Korea where we provide both troops and technology, in Taiwan where we just provide technology and arms like we do with Israel. Allies provide strategic support regardless of the GDP of the country because we want to be integrated with their military force. We want to be on the same page. And they provide to us critical frontline intelligence. Indeed, the story arrived last week that it was Israeli intelligence that allowed us to target Soleimani and remove him, which the foreign minister admitted was the greatest strategic blow that Iran has suffered in decades. So it's a cooperative relationship.
Yeah, but I mean, do you really think that the best use of $4 billion, right, or $3.8 billion each year right now is supplying bombs, et cetera, to Israel, that Israel can pay for itself, that it has the resources? I mean, as opposed to to injecting COVID around the world, to things we can do here in the U.S.?
Absolutely, I do. I think it's the most important strategic relationship the United States has in the world, and I would do the same thing with India, but they're not exclusive. We're about to spend $800 billion minimum in an infrastructure bill. It's a tiny amount. I support foreign aid to all of our allies, but it's a tiny amount. Last important question. Have you noticed that the coverage of Liz Cheney, and I had her on the show last week, and Elise Stefanik was ubiquitous, but the coverage of the split in the Democrats over Israel, where we have some anti-Israeli members of the Democratic Party, is unremarked upon. I mean, they don't even ask AOC and the squad if they believe in the right of Israel to exist. Why this disparity, Nick?
So that's interesting. So, I mean, the New York Times did have a major article on that split, precisely that split within the Democratic Party.
You're right. In fact, I led that. You're the only one I found. It's the only major news organization that I found, and I credited it in the first 2 hours of the show.
I have enough difficulty defending my own columns, let alone the New York Times, let alone the entire media establishment.
But you know what I'm talking about. It was wall to wall Liz Cheney, and I had her on my show too. But there's only this one article in the New York Times about this deep split. What is wrong with Beltway Manhattan media?
I think it is fair to say that should be covered more. I don't think it's just within the Democratic Party. I think it's a broad change in attitudes over time that you're particularly seeing in academia, that you're seeing in the Jewish community in the U.S. I mean, one of the great paradoxes now is that there's stronger support for the Netanyahu government within the American evangelical community than within the American Jewish community in terms of percentages. And I think there is something fundamental going on. It's also age-related, that younger people in the U.S. are more skeptical of Israeli policies than older people. And certainly the Democratic Party, very much reflects that change. And there is, as you say, a real fundamental dispute between many on the left wing of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration, which has taken a much more traditional approach to this conflict.
I just think that elite media has to bear down on it. Last question, happy question, Nick. You have traditionally taken a student from college with you on your journeys. I think it usually happens during the summer. Is COVID sufficiently in retreat in America that will allow you to do that this year?
Boy, I sure hope so. I had to cancel it last year. I've chosen a young woman, a public health expert and journalist, and we were unable to travel last year. I'm hoping to go this year to through southern Africa, and I'm waiting another month or two to assess whether or not we can go. But one reason I'd like to go is precisely because there is so much struggle in southern Africa right now with COVID. I think it'd be important to cover that.
Fingers crossed. Thank you, Nick Kristof. Always a joy to talk to you. Come right back, America. It's the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. It will be in the 90s inside the Beltway today. Who knows what happened to spring? I'm joined by one of my favorite guests, David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times. You see him on PBS often. Hello, David. How are you?
Good to be with you again.
It is good to have you. I think your column is very interesting. This is how wokeness ends. I said on Twitter, it's unusually sunny for you, David, to write this column. But we disagree, as you might have expected. Let's begin with your argument. Rod Dreher and I are among the people who are alarmed that wokeness is overwhelming everything on campus. You say not to worry. Why not?
Well, we've been through radical phases before, and they tend to peter out. In the 1960s and 70s, we had this radical New Left group who wanted to overthrow capitalism, and as I read in the column, they didn't overthrow capitalism, they gave us Whole Foods. And so what happens is that people just get exhausted with an ideological style of life, and they want to have a good life. And the good life usually involves some form of success. And in America, success is our prevailing ideology and tends to swarm all over all others. So in 1968, the campuses, like now, were filled with all this radicalism, violence. And then by 1975, they were into crystals and new agey stuff, and they wanted to get good jobs. And sort of burned off. And so I take that as an example of how America tends to tamp down the radicalisms and the ideologies and gives people a better lifestyle.
No, I have agreed with you forever. I tell people by 1978 it was disco and my commencement speaker was Solzhenitsyn. So things did change kind of in 10 years. This is different. And I agree with Rod because of the institutionalization, not of meritocracy, but of mediocrity. 5 years ago in Harvard Westlake, which you mentioned in your column, invited me to be a speaker. The students had to get permission slips from their parents. Me. I'm not exactly a flaming crazed conservative. They had to get a permission. That made me laugh. But yesterday I read in your newspaper, the New York Times, University of California will no longer consider SAT and ACT scores. Not merely optional, they absolutely won't consider them. I view this as embedding barriers against the meritocracy, David, not merely a phase.
Well, it depends what part of society we're dealing with. When I was 22, I had my first public debate, and it was against Christopher Hitchens. And I was on the left. I was on the right. He was on the left, and we debated at Bennington College, the most expensive school in the country. And he destroyed me. And then afterwards, to be nice, he said, you're never going to beat me at a college where the tuition is more than $40,000 a year. And his point was that at left-wing, at really rich schools where they're super privileged, they have to go way out of their way to prove how not privileged they are. And so you get Harvard Westlakes and Dalton schools and stuff like that. And that's where the wokeness is worse, at the most expensive places.
And that's where the meritocracy then sends their children on to the most credentialed schools. I'm going to come to why that might be changing. But if you end the ACTs and the SATs and wokeness infiltrates admission policy, then you're going to have a barrier to the meritocracy in which you and I used to posit our faith. The great leveler is, when law firms hire, they want smart people. When, the big five accounting firms hire, they want smart people. When interns go to D.C., they want the best and the brightest. When you hire a campaign consultant, you want the one who wins, right? The New York Times, you'd better be able to write before you show up asking for a job.
Yeah, I think there's this. I'm intimately familiar with a lot of these organizations, and there's a patina of wokeness beneath a cauldron of achievement orientation and competition. And so I think the achievement orientation is way more powerful than the politeness of wokeness. I will say, by the way, that I'm not totally happy with our meritocracy either. I think it's just crazy that we level society based on how you are at taking tests when you're 17. That's just an insane way to organize society. So I wouldn't mind a little change in the meritocracy.
No, I didn't note I don't know if you noted Glenn Youngkin's campaign for Virginia governor. He received the GOP nomination, center-right fellow, could win. He immediately glommed on to the Virginia Department of Education's announcement 2 weeks ago that they would no longer allow accelerated math classes for anyone below the 11th grade because it produced inequality. That is a dagger, not merely at meritocracy, but at the achievement of America overall. If we banish, and that's the Virginia State Department of Education. What do you make of that, David?
Yeah, my colleague Ross Stafford had a good column a couple of weeks ago where he said, if the left is going to fail, it's going to be not because of some culture war thing, it's because of policy failure. And that can happen in two ways. The first is crime. If we defund the police and all that kind of stuff and crime rates go up, then people will get really angry and vote out the left. The second is education. If people really want the best for their kids. They want them to get good, solid education. And if people don't allow that, then they will be voted out. And so these are the two areas where I think the political consequences could be massive.
Now, I heard former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this weekend say quite sincerely that the Chinese Communist Party is an existential threat, but far more importantly is the threat of American universities locking out diversity and secondary schools going into mediocrity. Now, I don't know if you've ever been a member of a tenured faculty where you have to go to these meetings. I have for 25 years, and it's changed dramatically, David, over 25 years. It used to be the conservatives are over here, the liberals over here, and let's all join hands to make sure we have a better U.S. News and World Report ranking. It ain't that way anymore. Academia has really become cloistered. Now, there is a Hillsdale, but for every Hillsdale, there are 15 state universities of X that are only hiring hard left. Does that not concern you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I for the last 20 years, I've taught at Yale, kind of elite institution. And I would say it has certainly moved left. I would say one of my students, a law student from who come from Louisiana, once said in the middle of class, I've never seen a place where people are so afraid to speak their minds. And after he said that, after class, a bunch of undergrads came up to me and said they agreed with him, but they couldn't say it in public.
See? Yeah.
And so it's definitely there. I'm not denying it. But there's also a large group of people who are upset by it. Now, whether they have the guts to stand up and say anything, I don't know. But I think my instinct, and this is what we disagree about, my instinct is the fervor dies down, the passion dies down. You can't stay apocalyptically alarmed for 5 years. It's just too exhausting. And that the people who really, enjoy having a conversation with people they disagree with, who I think is the vast majority, even at a place like Yale, they get to take over eventually.
I think it's the silent Stasi that worry me. The people who create truth squads for the right or the conservatives. Now, what will be the last bastion to fall will be Stuyvesant in New York and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, which are meritocracy-driven with alumni who are meritocracy admitted. But the General Counsel of Koch, who's been relieved of his or her duties, I can't remember if it was a man or a woman, stipulated that their law firms would have to give 20% of their billable hours to black lawyers. And I thought to myself, that's really radical. And that's really the beginning of the inversion of meritocracy, because you don't really care if your lease agreement's done by a white or a black or anybody in between. But that's out there, David, in corporate America. And you mentioned Major League Baseball becoming a blue sport and Delta becoming a blue airline and Coke becoming a blue soft drink. Does that ever stop, or are they under commercial pressure to keep going?
Yeah, I'm taking the historical view that America's a moralistic place that goes through these periods of zealotry, but those periods of zealotry have not lasted historically. And so I'm going with that. Now, there are things that are good and there are things that are bad, including more black lawyers is a good thing. Making sure it's like rigid and 20%, that's a bad thing. And so there's just a more subtle way of doing these things.
So my question would be, what will be your measurement for understanding that you were wrong in this regard?
If I get canceled.
No, really. What would you look up and say? I have my own measurements. One of them, interestingly, is inverse, the success of Hillsdale. It's just off the charts. The number of applications, the number of talented people who are sending their kids to Hillsdale is off the charts because they've got to get them out of, it's an elite, it's a counter-elite institution. What's your marker?
Yeah, I would say if not just Hillsdale, because Hillsdale's always been a conservative campus, but if a lot of people, and I think about this with my own kids, I'm not sending my kids to some elite school that's going to make it impossible for them to think for themselves. I'll send them to a big state school where they'll have a little more intellectual freedom. If we see a migration out of Ivy League type schools or the Benningtons or the Oberlins of the world into a big state school, that'll be a sign the market is responding to a failure. That would be what I'd look for.
And how about at a lower level in the secondary schools? I'm also going to watch enrollment in non-public schools with the virus gone, or at least defeated in America. It's not gone. So that when public schools reopen, if their enrollments are significantly down, I will say, okay, they really overplayed their hands, the teachers' unions, I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And also whether people just said, I don't want to go to Harvard Westlake. I don't want my kid indoctrinated. And as a parent, I certainly think that way now. I'd rather not have kids in places where it's just going to be impossible to think. And I can't be alone in that. And so people respond to things that are not working.
Last question, David. It's got nothing to do with your column, which is I recommend to everyone. Nick Kristof was on earlier, and we were talking about his column on Israel. Last week, it was wall-to-wall Liz Cheney, Elise Stefanik, and I was part of that. I had Liz Cheney on the show. I don't condemn that. It's a story. It might not have been that big of a story. This week, however, we've got a split in the Democratic caucus. AOC, Tlaib, and others calling for, basic. I don't know that they recognize the legitimacy of Israel. The New York Times ran a story. I haven't seen anything else. Is the news media pursuing the split in the Democratic Party with anything remotely like, the enthusiasm with which they pursued the split in the GOP story?
Well, the Liz Cheney story was voting out one of the leaders of the party. That was a pretty big deal. The Democrat is more of an intellectual split, I guess. So I think it's being covered. I certainly have read a bunch about it. I just wonder if AOC, does she understand what Hamas is? It's not like we're dealing with even the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen. Hamas is a creature that wants to destroy Israel. So I'm not sure that side ever is even acknowledged in a lot of the Bernie Sanders AOC arguments.
I don't think so, but I also don't think they're pressed. For example, do you believe in the right of Israel to exist would put AOC on the horns of a dilemma. But if they're not pressed, we never get to that next level. I do think it's a media fail, unlike they don't fail whenever it's a Republican division. That's my point. David Brooks, always a pleasure. Keep coming back. Great column. I hope you were right. I fear you were wrong, and people can make up their own minds. Thank you, David. We'll post the audio of that so people can listen to it again. Go read his column. I think the University of California ending SATs and ACT scores is a nightmare. Welcome back, America. Thanks to Diana W., Grace S., Robert C., Barbara W. for making kids go to the camps, enabling kids to go to the wonderful Angel Tree Fellowship camps. All you have to do is go to topofhughhewitt.com. We've sent 30 kids to camps this morning. It costs $200 per kid. Thank you. I'm joined by Josh Kraushaar, Hotline Josh of National Journal. Josh, good morning to you. Will there be a deal this week between Republicans and Democrats on infrastructure?
This week, I think, is a little too soon, but look, there is the makings of some degree of bipartisanship on infrastructure. With all the economic worries over the last week, inflation concerns, the jobs report in April, Democrats, there was a lot of political hubris taking place after the stimulus bill passed. I think they thought they were building political capital, that nothing could go wrong with the economy, and they could jam anything through Congress on a partisan vote, and Republicans would be on the defensive. Instead, there's a lot of, even within the Democratic Party, a lot of worry about the latest signals of inflation, the disappointing jobs report, and they want to they're not going to be able to spend as much money as the $4 trillion or so that was proposed in these packages. And meanwhile, Republicans want to get beyond this whole the division with Cheney and McCarthy, and they'd like to have a governing success. McConnell was on a special report with Bret Baier last week and signaled that he was optimistic that there could be some kind of deal in the future, that Democrats are moving towards his position. So, I think you have the makings of both parties having an interest in reaching a grand bargain and cutting back the level of spending, lowering the hikes and tax increases, and trying to find some middle ground on infrastructure.
All right, second topic, Josh. You've got a fairly objective eye on the media. Last week it was wall-to-wall Liz Cheney and Elise Stefanik. And, of course, I had Liz Cheney on this show, too. It was a big story. But I don't know if it was as big as to blot out the sun or the Israeli attack, the attack on Israel from Hamas. This week, there's a split in the Democratic Party between AOC, Rashid Tlaib, and others like Bernie Sanders, who are just simply standing with Hamas, a terrorist organization against Israel, and the rest of the traditional Democratic Party. And I saw one story in the New York Times, one, about this split, which is far more significant than a leadership vote, as Dan Crenshaw argued to Chuck Todd yesterday. Nobody talks about this. Everybody talks about Israel. Why doesn't the media dig into what AOC and Bernie really think? Do they believe that Israel has a right to exist? Does that question even get asked of AOC?
Well, it should be. I actually picked up the Washington Post this morning, and I think this is the first time that Tel Aviv and cities in central Israel have been directly impacted by rockets since the first Gulf War. And you wouldn't know it from reading the headline in today's Washington Post. I don't even think the notion that Israel was being rained with thousands of rockets, jeopardizing the lives of civilians in the country was even drew a mention in the headline. So there's a shift among the left, among sort of the elites, so to speak, when it comes to the Middle East, and it's driven by sort of social media. It's driven by these members who are very left wing, AOC. There are others that are getting a lot of attention. I don't think they reflect the majority of American public opinion, but they're dominating the conversation. They're dominating the pressure that is being put on the party. I will say that President Biden and his administration have been pretty level-headed in throughout all this. They've allowed that Israel has a right to defend itself, and I think that's a pretty notable step given where the party's base is heading. But no, you're right. I mean, I always like to say in politics, the party that's divided is the party that's losing the debate. And look, you literally have a Democratic Party split in two. There was a letter that 28 Democratic senators signed calling for an immediate ceasefire, and I think Israel wants to have a little more time to take out some of Hamas's assets, military assets. And you had 21 Democrats, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Foreign Relations Committee Chair Bob Menendez, not sign this petition, and a lot of other prominent Democratic senators in that bunch. So yeah, you're right, Hugh. This is an issue that splits Democrats, and and if you look at the public opinion polling, Israel has 60-70+% of public support in these fights.
It splits Democrats and it illumines the partisan nature of the media. I saw this headline in the New York Times yesterday. After years of quiet, Israeli-Palestinian conflict exploded. Why now? ? Well, that would come along with 3,000 missiles being shot at Israel. I mean, why now is not exactly a genuine question, but just the volume and intensity of the coverage of the Republican split last week and the near muffled silence on the split this week tells me that the extension of the DNC, that is many parts of the elite media, does not want to cover their problem, Josh. Do you think I'm nuts or am I right?
Well, I think there's a bigger issue, which is the coverage of Israel in particular. And I think you have, again, if you look at the polling, if you look at public opinion, this is a segment of the left, a very, very progressive element of the Democratic Party. It's not a majority of the Democratic Party in public opinion. It's certainly not even close to a majority of the country. But when you look at the coverage, I've been struck that you might not even realize that Israel is under bombardment by a terrorist organization on its border. I mean, if that was happening to the United States, you better believe that we'd be declaring war against.
I can't even imagine 3,000 missiles in the United States. What we would be doing, if Cuba launched 3,000 missiles at Florida, there wouldn't be a Cuba. The 101st and the 82nd would be there. Josh Kraushaar, Hotline Josh on Twitter. Thank you. Thank you, Adam and Harley. Thank you, Ben and Dwayne. Thanks all of you for listening. Don't forget Angel Tree Camps. Just go over to HughHewitt.com. Let it load. Please be generous. Get these kids to camp after 2 years and come back to tomorrow's Hugh Hewitt Show.